And welcome from me. My name is Jennifer Bowen. I've been a radio producer with the BBC World Service and Radio National in Australia, and I've taught audio journalism at Monash University. I too am with the ABC Friends Inner Melbourne group. ABC Friends is an organisation that for 50 years, almost 50 years, has campaigned and raised awareness of the ABC as an essential part of Australian cultural and civic life. So that raises an interesting question with tonight's guests. How does an ABC for audiences outside Australia come into its purpose? Many of us are familiar with Radio Australia. That, though, is only a part of what's happening now. There are services that involve rebroadcasting, television, online components, and social media. We've called this evening's discussion ABC International, Who Benefits? And that's not to suggest that there's only one beneficiary. There may, in fact, be several. There is, however, only one funding source, and that's us, the Australian public. So the question, who benefits, I think is a pretty fair one to ask. And we should get some answers tonight, thanks to our two guests. We're delighted to welcome Claire Gorman. Claire has been the head of ABC International since 2020. Prior to this, she had several senior roles at the ABC, managing editorial standards across a range of content areas, including news, sport, and music. And just along from Claire, we have Dr Phil Kafcaloudes, a former Radio Australia presenter, also a journalist and a writer. He's the author of the ABC's History of Radio Australia, the book Australia Calling. Would you please welcome our guests? The format for this evening is that I'm going to ask both Claire and Phil a few questions so that we're all on the same page. And then it's over to you. It'll be your turn to ask questions that spring from anything they might have said or perhaps omitted to say in the first part of this evening, or new material altogether, so long as it relates to ABC International and the whole notion of broadcasting, creating media for an audience outside Australia by the ABC. So let's just make a start. And I'm really interested in how it is that both of you came to be involved with international media of one form or another. So just to start with you, Claire, I did look in your bio and found that you worked for AusAID, an Australian government development agency, not an NGO. You worked for it several years before you joined the ABC. And I wonder if there is a connection between that kind of work and what you're doing now with the media.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jennifer. So AusAID's Australian Government Aid Agency, a lot of the work that I did when I was in AusAID was around behaviour change communications as well. So that's a really important pillar often in humanitarian aid programs, is around behaviour change and education and so on. So the other sort of aspect of the work that I did in AusAID was working in the Pacific, but in PNG in particular, and that sort of stimulated, I guess, a lifelong interest in PNG in particular, but the Pacific more broadly, and I also did some work in Indonesia and so on. So following on from that, after some travel, I came back to Australia and worked in human rights research. So that was for a couple of years, and from that point, that's kind of how I got the job in the ABC, because I was very interested in that, how independent media supported democracy, supported the rule of law, and supported human development in a way that was sustainable and benefited all. And so that's kind of that was part of my pitch really when I was being interviewed for the role of a the editorial policies advisor for ABC Radio. When I was working in ABC Radio back then, under Jean-Gabriel Monguy, Radio Australia was in the radio division. And I remember, sort of fairly junior burger policy person in the ABC working to the then director of radio, Sue Howard, thinking about, Radio Australia and being really fascinated by that. And this is 23 years ago, mind you, thinking, I wonder one day whether I might be able to manoeuvre myself into working in the ABC's international division. I had retained that kind of interest, a really strong interest in international affairs, in development, and really just kept up my knowledge base around that before being able to kind of manoeuvre myself finally into the international division. Yeah.
Which you've done very successfully.
Yeah.
You're the head of it after all.
Yeah.
Now, Phil, I just want to get a sense too of how your previous life has contributed to your involvement with international broadcasting, because you've been a broadcaster on the ABC's domestic services, television and radio, news radio, but also metropolitan radio, and you've been a presenter on Radio Australia. And I just wonder how different it is being on Radio Australia when you're broadcasting to an audience that you're just not likely to run into anywhere.
Yeah, I was working, when I was in television, I worked for AusAID. We delivered training in Samoa, PNG, Fiji, Vietnam, Malaysia. We did quite a few different things. So it was great. And I'd cross across many Radio Australia people as I did that. But I'd always go back to my day job, which was being a political reporter in Sydney and television. And then I came to Melbourne and worked for News Radio. Now, the thing with News Radio was that I was the only part of News Radio that was based in Melbourne. Everyone else was in Sydney, a couple were in Brisbane. And the only place they could find for me, Murray Green, the former head of ABC Victoria at the time, he said, oh, it would be great if you could be down there. He wanted a bit of news radio in his state. So he found me a tiniest little booth that was about this big, and it was the sound recording booth in Radio Australia. So every morning I'd get in there at 3 o'clock and I'd start preparing I did newspapers, I did Australian news, and I did that for 6 years, 3 o'clock in the morning. And it was a nightmare. So I would see the people in Radio Australia coming in at 7:30 or 8 o'clock talking about the red wine they had last night, and I went, I want a bit of that, and I know that's really why you want to do international, same thing. And so I thought I'll go to Jean-Gabriel Monguy, who was the head of Radio Australia, and I put in a proposal for an afternoon show. I said, I don't want any more breakfast shows, right? After 20-something years of getting up at 3 or 4. And so I gave him this brief and he went, oh, and you know what he was like. He's a very charming, tall French guy, and Deborah Steele is there. You remember what he was like. He just was such a beautiful man. And he said, we would love to have you. Here is the deal. You do it. And I went, great, afternoon show, this would be beautiful. After I'd signed on, he said, except we're making it a breakfast show. But it is a breakfast show for our new Asian stream and our Pacific stream, so you'll have to start broadcasting at 5 o'clock. So that made it even earlier in the morning. So thank you very much, Jean-Gab. But I did it for 9 years, and we'll talk about this anyway, but it was a tightrope. I wrote a paper on this once, the tightrope of broadcasting to the Pacific and to... You think about Raph Epstein. He broadcasts to Melbourne, and he broadcasts largely to like-thinking people in Melbourne. If you're a right-winger, go to 3AW or Sky. But a lot of his listeners are actually sensible people. So he has this group that is really small in the one time zone. We had to broadcast from American Samoa, so if I start at 5 in the morning, Samoa it is late in the morning. And we also we don't broadcast to the Maldives anymore, do we? No. But we had an FM share in the Maldives. So in the Maldives, when I started at 5, it was like midnight. So my show that we called stupidly, and I remember Deborah saying, "Why are you calling it The Breakfast Club?" And I couldn't quite understand. I thought, oh, it's a cool title. But it wasn't a breakfast. It was breakfast for people in the middle, but not for Samoa, not for the Maldives. It was entirely wrong. So we changed it to another name, Radio Australia Today. And I remember Deborah saying, don't like that name either. So it was the difficulty of doing that, but also dealing with two types of audience, the Pacific audience and all those countries, and the Asian audience on FM and all of those countries. It was a tightrope, yeah.
So can I ask then how you determined what you were going to put out? Because if you think back to the very beginnings of international broadcasting from Australia, the beginnings of Radio Australia, Australia Calling, and you've written about this in your history, the answer was quite simple. It was propaganda, yes?
Or they called it anti-propaganda because the Russians, the Germans, the Japanese are putting out all this stuff in 1939 about Australia. They were telling a whole lot of porkies. The Russians were saying that we stole the land off the indigenous people. And Robert Menzies went, "You can't say that about us," you know. And of course they were 100% right, you know. But at the time he got really angry about it, and that was one of the driving forces why he did it, why he wanted an Australian voice to counter that sort of stuff. It may have been true, but how dare they say it? But there were a lot of other things that they were putting out as well. So it was anti-propaganda. But as we went on, we became self-censoring, as you do in wartime. You know, we would highlight, and I was just reading a bit in the book this afternoon about how Radio Australia it was called then Australia Calling, was encouraged to not describe how Japanese soldiers went wave after wave against the British and the Australian New Zealanders and how brave they were. So don't say any of that, but do report when they run away scared, you know? So there was all of this kind of twisting it, but it was wartime. Everyone else was doing it, but how does that sit with the ABC? It was weird. So how do that was its purpose then. But by the time I came along in 2005, we still had the same questions about what was our purpose. And in the end, Nye's talk about soft diplomacy really is about as much as is the best way I could have put it. Do broadcasting that interests as many people as possible and gives them a sense of what we are like. Yeah.
Claire, would you say that is still the rationale for ABC International?
It's part of the rationale. So very much, we unashamedly think of ourselves as what we do is soft power. But as an independent public broadcaster established under the ABC Act, we're not an arm of government and we don't execute the government's foreign policy. So there's a little bit of a tightrope that we walk there, but we absolutely want to show to our audience modern Australia with all its great elements and those elements too that are troubling, that are difficult. Rich Indigenous history, but a very dark Indigenous history. But what are we doing in regard to reconciliation? And we don't shy away from talking or putting out stories and so on, which covered the Indigenous people's reaction following the failed referendum and so on. So, but we're telling stories about a very multicultural Australia. We're explaining what Australia is. We're focusing on those stories that would have the most interest for the audience. But say for the Pacific, I mean, you can't. You're not going to get an audience if you're just going to talk about Australia. So what can we do that gives us a unique offer for the Pacific audience. And what we can do is we can tell stories that are, pan-Pacific stories. We can provide for the Pacific audience news and information and analysis and entertainment about all of, across the whole of the Pacific region and all its territories. So to do that, what we do is we do a lot of content making in the region. We have a Pacific Local Journalism Network that we've been able to engage under the Indo-Pacific Broadcasting Strategy funding, which we were successful in getting in 2022. That journalism network feeds stories into our news and current affairs and to our other programming. And then we have now, where once the hub for Radio Australia was down in Melbourne, our hub now is really Brisbane, and we've built that in Brisbane. We do have Radio Australia staff in Melbourne still, and we have Radio Australia staff in Sydney and elsewhere as well, but we've built it in Brisbane because there is a large Pacific diaspora in Brisbane. So while we can't positively discriminate under legislation to ensure that we are hiring people of Pacific heritage, we do, as part of our recruitment processes, we're looking for people who've got a really deep ability and understanding of Pacific issues and ability to attract that audience. So naturally, we do end up with more people of Pacific heritage. And they're telling stories about communities that they come from here in Australia, but also, following their good journalistic content making noses to get the best stories that are going to appeal to the audience. And what we're doing is we're offering something unique in the Pacific media market, because local media outlets don't have the resources to be able to do that kind of content making and storytelling across the whole of the region, but we can, and that's what we see as our unique difference. And we have the audience reach that is really satisfactory, given we're an international broadcaster. We can always get more, but we are...
numbers are pretty good.
The numbers are great, yeah. As an international broadcaster, my view, and it's one of our fundamental principles, that as an international broadcaster, you should never be going into a market to be the dominant market force, particularly given so under my remit is also the International Development Unit, and we engage in media capacity building and journalism training across the Indo-Pacific region. We have a lot of projects where we work in the Pacific in particular, and the role of that unit is to support local media to be able to tell their own stories, to do so in an independent way. Now we know, some markets are very small. They don't have that capacity within their own media. So, say for example, in a country like Tuvalu, we're looking wherever we can to support local media. So we'll share content. We'll do a lot of capacity building work with the Tuvalu public broadcaster there. But, in a country like Fiji, we're not going in to say we want to have, the reach and we want to be dominating all the local media. It's not appropriate. It's not what we should be doing.
I wonder not simply about competition with local media, and I think a lot of people would be pleased to hear that you're not seeking to replace it, but I wonder nonetheless about other sorts of competition from other international broadcasters or media outfits. To what extent is that something that you take on board?
We look at what that competition is doing, absolutely. And
where is it from, by the way?
Well, look, there is a significant investment from the PRC in the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party in Chinese media outreach. You can't get exact figures, but the estimates are, $9 billion a year they spend on international media.
9 billion?
Billion. Yeah, 9
Wow.
billion.
Wow.
I mean, look, those figures vary. Some will say 3 billion, but it's still so vastly, so vastly in excess of anything that we do. So what we do, we do what we do best, really, and we're modelling independent public interest media. We are telling stories that matter to people. We're not doing propaganda. We are honest about, we report impartially on what's happening in Australia around climate change, for example, and the, political debates around climate change and so on. So we don't shy away from any of that. And we just, we let that shine, really. But we've got very high levels of trust across our Pacific markets in particular. So it sort of averages out to about, I think it's 75% of the audience trust the ABC. We have a trust rating of 75% in those key markets across the region. And we have much higher reach than what our audience research is telling us that, say, the China Radio International or CGTN has in those markets.
I just wondered too, when you talk about the need to be reporting impartially, and you think of climate change, and today the announcement that the COP31 summit will take place in Turkey rather than in Adelaide. And there's already been reports of objections to this from PNG. You presumably need to recognise this, and at the same time there could be some pressure from the Australian government to present the Australian point of view. And I wonder to what extent you have processes that enable you to work out, again, how to stay upright on a tightrope where you have one party urging you to do this, another party urging you to do that, and across the whole of your audience area, you have a lot of legitimate but different interests. Phil, you're nodding, actually. Have you been there? Are you familiar with this from the history?
I remember once having a news director say to me, and that's when I was at News Radio, have you ever had a member of the government tell you what you should do? And she asked everybody, and nobody at News Radio had ever in their career, and they were senior journalists, had ever been told by the government what to do. We'd all been monstered, like, Malcolm Turnbull was he could monster. How many times could he tell someone they're a fuckwit? It's just unbelievable. That was what he did, but that was his style. Bob Carr monstered me, but they didn't demand. I never got it. You probably are the gatekeeper, like in Ghostbusters, where you have to be the one where the monsters attack. But we were always feeling protected, and never did I have a government ever say. If it was perceived that we were biased, I remember I did a thing on Radio Australia after my mum died, and I said, there is a really good argument for allowing for euthanasia. And a person in the Pacific, very Christian, said, we need to have the other side of that argument, and the ABC my boss decided, we better get a priest on just to balance it a little, and fair enough on that. But that's the only time ever I've been told that we needed to balance what I did, but never before, never since. Yeah.
Yeah. We have worked hard with government. I deal a lot with the bureaucracy and Department of Communications and Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and so on. Look, there's a good understanding of the ABC and its independence. Like, there's not pressure being applied to us to report a particular party line or anything like that. I mean, we do what we do with making sure that we're impartial, that the relevant perspectives are told on any particular issue. That's not the ABC expressing a view about that. That's the views of the relevant perspectives within that particular subject matter or debate. In relation to COP30 and whether it was going to be in Australia or in Turkey, we have done We've done a lot of coverage over that, particularly in the last couple of months and in the lead up to Belém. And there hasn't been a problem with that. I mean, we're often getting Pacific voices and relevant, or vocal ministers from across the Pacific who have really strong views about that. So, Ralph Regenvanu, who's a very prominent minister in Vanuatu and very articulate about climate change, a big advocate for action on climate change and quite critical of the Australian government often. We have him on air regularly, and just as we do with all other, good, in terms of good editorial decision making, make sure that, we're relevant, that we would also be seeking the views of the Australian government and putting those to air.
Phil?
I remember when Fiji, which is before your time in international, but when Frank Bainimarama took over in his coup in 2006, we were on air at the time, and of course there was so much criticism because he made a coup. He had usurped government, and so we were able to keep going because we were on FM there. And our FM, I don't know if it's still the same, but our FM transmitter was in the mountains outside Suva. And
they forgot about you, didn't they?
They kept demanding we shut down, and we kept saying no. And in the end, and so we were broadcasting through Pacific Beat and our other programs, we were broadcasting all the criticism of the government against Bainimarama. We were the only ones able to do that, because the first thing that Bainimarama and his Attorney General were able to do was shut down all media, and they put people into the newsrooms. And it's funny that Deborah's here because you were the news editor at the time, so you remember this very well. And we were able to, through our news programs, put this criticism. Eventually, what happened, so I was told by John Westland, who was our partnerships manager, they eventually found our technician at gunpoint, took him to where the transmitter was running on diesel, I think it was, in the mountains, and forced him to shut it down. But until that point, we were the only way that Fijians were actually hearing what was really going on, and not just all the pap that was being fed by this usurping government. Eventually, we got back on again, I don't know how, but at the time, that was one of the great values of what we were doing, talking about, who benefits. It wasn't us, even though we're paying for it, it was the Fijian people.
Just on that issue around independence, if I can just kind of unpick a little bit of that too. We have greater impact in terms of soft power, in terms of engagement from the audiences that we go out to, because we're resolutely independent, and there will be voices that may be critical of the Australian government and what's happening in Australia that go on our platform. So one of the things that we talk about, and we've communicated this to government, and they, in theory understand it, is that is then modelling independent media and how independent media supports a well-functioning democracy. So that's a really powerful thing too. But one of the other sort of element of that we would explain to the government if we needed to is that there is actual strength, for you in what you're trying to achieve in engaging with the Pacific or engaging with Southeast Asia and so on, in people in the region, governments in the region, seeing that the public broadcaster can do that and not have their funding taken away.
Of course, everybody thinks that way, don't they? Nobody should take funding from a public broadcaster. Look, I could ask a whole heap more questions, but I'm going to actually turn it over to the audience now, to you. If you're quiet, I'll jump in again. But is there anybody who would like to start by putting a question to either Claire or Phil? And we do have a microphone that can make the most of your voice. Would anybody like to start? Yes, we have somebody here. Brendan, are you in a position? Do you want a helper to pass it around?
Okay, thanks. People who are streamers, they can feed stuff into the internet now. It must fundamentally change what used to be the situation where, you know, there was government-controlled licences issued here and in other countries and whatever. But now streamers, well, it's open slather, I presume. Just wanted to see what your views are on how streaming affects what you're trying to do.
Yeah, look, the media markets across the whole of the globe are changing a lot, and audience behaviour is changing really dramatically. There is still a place for mass media. There is still a place for big media houses like the ABC. What you have to do, though, you know, we call them fragmented digital media markets. So, you know, you have that people listening to audio on demand or streaming. You have, you know, you have the big subscription video on demand platforms in markets. You have people. You have TikTok. You have Facebook. You have Instagram, and people watching short form video on there or using that as their primary media source. You do have people still listening to the radio, and in particular in the Pacific region, there's some research that's come out that the BBC Media Action did in Vanuatu, which looked at the media market in Vanuatu and resolutely showed that there are people, particularly in the more remote areas, who are absolutely using radio as their media source. There's still, people read digital text articles still. What it means for a media organisation like the ABC is that although you may have a finite amount of resources, that you have to spread those out and make really judicious decisions around ensuring that you're on all the platforms and services that people are using. So that means you have to, you know, we now have newsrooms and content teams that do not just audio but may do digital media, that may do also social media and etc. So yeah, it's just really, there is absolutely value in mass media still, but it's not mass media just in terms of the traditional broadcast platforms. That's not going to lead you to a sustainable audience.
Can I just ask, not just in connection with the different forms of platform that you're using, but, you know, we've talked about the audience, but do you see that you have different audiences? So you might be appealing in a particular way to more urban people and more remote people, different according to people's gender, according to their age, according to their level of media literacy, perhaps? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, so the way people consume media on social media channels, for example, you know, what you're doing when you're creating content for that is you need to understand how the algorithm works and what the algorithm will do in order to serve content that you know, how do you craft that content so it's going to get to as many eyeballs as possible, and who's looking at that, you know, generally speaking, but not exclusively so. It's more of, you know, you've got a more younger cohort in terms of the audience. For the more traditional forms of broadcast media, radio and so on, you know, the audience is of an older cohort. But a lot of the content that you're making for, say, radio, or you're making for digital media, it will be actually packaged up differently for different platforms. So there's different ways of looking at it. We don't have a specifically youth-focused strategy for ABC Radio Australia, and there's more. Like, if you had more funding and more resources, you could do more of everything, you know, and say, well, this is what we're going to do for, you know, audiences from age 15 up to 30. They're going to be, you know, but we don't have that level of resourcing, so we have to think of as broader base as possible. But and what we do is we look at genres. So we do a lot of music programming, and we take, particularly for the Pacific, we focus on those styles of music that are most popular in the Pacific. So it's reggae, it's soul and R&B, a lot of local music and so on. We have programs that focus on women's issues. There's a program that we started a number of years ago called Sisters Let's Talk that specifically looks at the issue of gender and women's participation in the public sphere and the private sphere and all the challenges that women face across the whole of the region. And that's, we're not focusing on, we're looking at stories from across an age bracket, period poverty for young girls at school and what the impact of that is, all of those sorts of things. So yeah, there's lots of different strategies we employ to try and ensure that we're getting a broader base as possible for Radio Australia. One thing I would say just around that kind of rural-urban divide and whether are we going for a more remote and rural or audience. Our FM transmission footprint is in urban. We are only able to target urban and peri-urban regions, the most populous centres across the Pacific. We don't broadcast now on shortwave radio. Our approach to reaching audiences outside of those big urban centres is to share our content as widely as possible with local media, so aiming to support them in terms of sustaining content's very expensive to create, giving them that high-value content. That's how we might reach people outside of that area. But the other thing is just by nature of being a public broadcaster, we don't have the resources to broadcast in or do content in all local languages. So we are going for a more educated demographic, mostly high school or university educated, mostly urban, and they're going to be their own interests in sort of the world outside of their own patch are going to drive what their media habits are and what they're going to follow.
And things have changed as well. When I started, we didn't have the online hate forums that we've got now, and that's when, the ABC, people will tune in and know that their news is going to be okay, it's going to be good. But it was interesting, one picture that I found in the book that I'd forgotten about is a village in East Indonesia where they were all crowded around listening to the one village radio to hear it. It's a lovely photograph. I should have brought it up, but that was great. And also Caroline Tiraman, who was from PNG, she told me the story and I thought, come on, you're having me on, Caroline. She said it's true. She lived in the highlands of PNG, and she said her dad brought home a radio and they were quite big, and put it on the ground, tuned it to Radio Australia in the 60s, and she thought, oh my gosh, those radio people are very small to fit inside that box. And I went, come on, Caroline. I really thought there was a person in the box talking to us. That was his little house, So things have... In the Highlands, that was the importance. That's where they got their news from us, from that. And of course, it's different now. When I started in 2005, we were still shortwave. Jean-Gabriel had started this thing of getting us on FM around the region. It had been going on for a little time, but he really was pushing that and the push into Asia and also getting us online as well. So we moved right out of... And that was 20 years ago. 95? Yeah. 2005, 20 years ago was the big change that happened. And I remember going to PNG once and driving one evening and hearing a promo. I could tune in on the radio there, Up until then, you couldn't. You have to have an FM. You'd have to have, a shortwave radio. Yeah. So in every car, and I heard my own promo coming through the back speakers in the car, and it scared the hell out of me. It was just like... what am I doing behind me? You know, it was really weird. But that was the new age. You know, that was the change of things to happen. And yes, when shortwave closed down in 2017, Nigel Holmes, our long-serving technical guy, he pressed the button, and the photograph of that moment is in the book, of him, you know, being, and I spoke to him a lot in research for the book, and he said it was just one of those moments where I went, I'm going to close down Shepparton broadcasting on shortwave. It opened in 1944, and my finger is going to stop. You know, 70 years, 44 to, 70 years, 73 years of broadcasting. And he did. And it was a life-changing moment for him. But, you know, we had to move on. Yeah.
Speaking of which, we have a further question from Michael at the back.
Thanks, and thanks very much for this evening. This is fabulous. Claire, you mentioned resources, and as I understand it, your resources are to be renewed reasonably soon or not. Would either of you like to comment on how vulnerable you are to them not being renewed, and what do you think the chances are that you might even get further resources this time?
Well, we'd love to have the $8 billion the Chinese have got.
Well, I say that. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, there's just up at the front some little booklets which give you a really good overview of where we broadcast into, where we go into, what our teams do in digital and social. It's got a table in there that we we sort of track and update, but it shows the budget comparisons between some of the major international public broadcasters. So, estimates of around what CGTN and, China International Radio and so on are at about 7 billion. Russia Today is ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous numbers, really, they're huge. BBC World Service, about £319 million a year, which is about 610 million Australian. If we were funded on the same per capita basis as the BBC was funded, we would get about 250 million a year. We have our budget this year sits at around 20 million with some different uptakes that we get. We're quite vigorous in going to government and applying for grants and knocking on doors and talking to all sorts of different arms of government to explain to them what they could do if they could give us some more money. So we sort of incrementally increase our budget. But we have a baseline of funding from within the ABC's general appropriation. It's been at about 11 million since the cancelling of the Australia Network contract in 2014, and that sits at about 11 million a year. I think I mentioned that before. So when I came into the role in 2020, we moved into the strategy division. The strategy division's director had worked in as a chief of staff with Stephen Conroy in the previous government, and was top gun at government relations and so on. And so because we sat in that division, I just had really good access to that machinery, which meant we could engage with government a lot better and talk about what we could do. And obviously the geostrategic environment was changing really massively at that time. So there was a sort of fertile field within government around what we were proposing and how we could do a lot of work in the national interest in terms of soft power and engaging audiences across the Indo-Pacific region. So in 2022, Labor came into power, and we were able to secure an additional $8 million a year for our activities. That funding was topped up again in the following budget in 2023, but that $8 million a year is what we're seeking now to be renewed, and we've had ongoing conversations with government about the importance of ensuring that renewal and the commitment for it happens at the earliest time, so that we can ensure that we can continue on without having to stop things and start again, lose good staff and so on. So the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, all the relevant ministers, Department of Communications and so on have assured us that there's no likelihood of the funding not being renewed. It's just about when that actually happens. Will it be MYEFO, which they still haven't held yet? It's proposed that will be in early December, but it could be January. We could get the announcement within the budget in May next year. The funding, the bulk of the funding terminates at the end of June 2026. And in order for us to continue on seamlessly, we really need assurance, a commitment, but as early as possible. So if any of you would like to write a letter to Ministers Conroy, Green, Wong, Ali, etc., please feel free.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have another question, just by the way? Leonie, yeah.
Hello. I was just wondering, with going to different countries, do you have any problems with censorships? For example, your program's being banned by a particular country, or not? That's the question.
Yes, at times, yes, we do. And at times we just annoy the government. And get, nasty op-eds printed that look very strikingly like they've been written by the Chinese embassy. So yes, we can get a bit of backlash from time to time. Some governments in some countries a little bit trickier than others. Vanuatu, for example, particularly at the moment, we do seem to be, I call it poking the bear a little bit. But we're still carrying on and doing what we need to do and telling stories impartially, and making sure that we are telling the stories that matter to the people of Vanuatu. And there was an incident, Lily Rose Wellwell, who's our local journalist in Port Vila, did a story about the earthquake recovery. This is a little bit earlier on this year, and covered the fact that the government themselves were saying that some of the building codes were not quite right, and particularly some of the bigger Chinese-built buildings, infrastructure and so on had not fared well in the quake, and there was no money for and no support from the Chinese government to repair those buildings. There was backlash that came back to us. We got a particularly nasty op-ed written about how the ABC was stirring up trouble and was, didn't have the best interests of Vanuatu and so on, but you just have to ride that out, really.
Did it affect the reporter who was there?
Yeah. So she's, she knew what she was getting into, but in those instances, we provide a lot of support around the reporter in question if they're going to, suffer backlash around that as well. So, there may be instances where we would extract the reporter, or put in place extra, sometimes security, those sorts of things, yeah. And support around managing their own social media profile and any commentary that might be getting from on that as well. But there are times, our international TV channel, ABC Australia, goes into markets where, like Malaysia, for example, we go out on multi-service operators in across all of the region. So like on a satellite or a cable service, we're one of many channels. In Malaysia, all of the service operators are required to monitor everything that goes out. on every channel that they carry, and they will at times go to black and go to a black screen, or maybe sometimes sub another program in if they know that they would get into trouble themselves from their own government and regulators if that content went to air.
More questions? Yes.
Hi, this is particularly directed to Claire. Thank you so much for your words earlier. I just want to ask if you can give your thoughts about the success of Pacific Beat, and what would the future looks like for Pacific Beat. Thank you.
You mean the news and current affairs program? It's a daily news and current affairs program that goes out.
It's a television program, isn't it?
No, that's the Pacific, I think.
Right, okay,
yeah. So Pacific Beat is a 1 hour news and current affairs program, goes out every morning, Monday to Friday. The future of Pacific Beat is bright. But there's no plans really other than just to do what we do normally, which is aim for continuous improvement, and not that, they'll have any particular concerns about it. They do a really good job. It's a program that is able to air the voices of local journalists across the Pacific region, tell the big stories of the region every day. We know that it has really good listenership across the region as well. It's taken by a lot of local radio operators across the region. It's highly valued internally within the ABC, and we know also that it's got quite a big listenership within in Canberra as well, and at the top levels of government, which is good for us. That's not our primary audience. Our primary audience is absolutely in the Pacific, but the future's bright for Pacific Beat.
Can I just add something too, that we're talking about governments and about stability and how much money you're getting. It was interesting looking at the history of Radio Australia, how many times it nearly died. When Bob Menzies, who started Radio Australia, came back into power in 1949, I was just looking at a quote today from Percy Spender, who was the Minister for External Affairs, and he didn't like what he was hearing in 1947, and so he and Menzies got together and they're going to shut it down. And the only reason it wasn't shut down in 1949, 1950 was because MI5 sent a missive to Menzies to say, don't shut it down, because Radio Australia's transmitters in Shepparton, they were huge, 2 100-watt transmitters. They started with 2 kilowatts, sorry. So it was tiny. I mean, that's a stereo. But somehow the joys of shortwave, MI5 managed to convince Menzies not to shut it down. And then it happened again. It was communications ministers, for some reason, didn't like Radio Australia. And they almost closed it down under Howard, and Richard Alston hated it. And so he wanted to shut it down, and it was Alexander Downer.
Yeah.
And that was one of the joys when I wrote the book, is talking to Downer, because he's a funny guy. He would have been a disastrous Prime Minister, but he was a funny guy. And he said, you know what, you should have a statue made of me and put it in the foyer of Radio Australia because I saved you. And then he said, towards the end, he said, and when is the launch? And I said, what, for the book or your statue? Whoa, he thought it was very funny. But he was the one. And it was only because one of our reporters, I think it was Graham DeBell, whispered in his assistant's ear that Richard Alston was going to close down radio. He wanted Radio Australia closed. And Alexander Downer said, over my dead body, went into the cabinet room and said, what's all this about? And Alston thought it was a thing. It was going to be done, and it was tied up. And he'd had John Howard's ear, and somehow he carried the day. We lost services. Some were closed down, but it survived. And that was a big thing. But how many times do we come close to closing down. It was extraordinary.
Look, it's almost time to wind up, and that actually takes us to the question that we began with this evening, which is ABC International, who benefits? And we've heard so well from you about how many people across the Pacific and your catchment area are benefiting. But let's just bring it back to people in Australia and the sort of people that Alexander Downer would be concerned about, not just himself, but maybe his electorate. How is it that people in Australia are benefiting from ABC International? If you can each answer relatively briefly, because then we need to conclude.
Yeah. Look, in many ways, I would have to say. So, our focus for ABC International is about engaging with our region, telling stories to our region, but also one of the things that we can do uniquely in our operations is when we're going out into the region, we're telling stories about the region, we're creating content about the region. We actually bring that content back and it's run on the ABC's domestic services. And I don't know if you've noticed, but since 2022, when we established the Pacific Local Journalism Network, there has been a lot more coverage of the Pacific on the ABC across all of our platforms and all of our output. So never before really would you have got, a story on the 7 p.m. news that looked at what was happening in the Solomon Islands. Now you do. And sometimes on the 7:30 report, we're about to, I can't say too much, but we're about to do a really interesting story that's a two-parter for Foreign Correspondent. Will go out next year and it's focused on the Pacific. We have put funding into Foreign Corro to be able to do that kind of content. So in terms of engaging audiences in the region, they understand Australia more, they feel connected with Australia, they're interested in Australia because they're learning about Australia. There's that. But for Australian audiences, about learning more, we call it, increasing Pacific literacy and increasing literacy in Asia amongst the Australian people. It's a really, really important thing to do. Our coverage of international news and current affairs across the whole of the mainstream media is so focused on the UK and the US, and our future is in Asia. Sorry, I'm going to get on my soapbox here, but our future is in Asia, our future is in the Pacific. If we don't increase Australians' engagement with the region, they're not going to understand what our foreign policy output is. They're not going to understand, making a stronger treaty with Indonesia and those things that we absolutely really need to do. It's existential for us. We're a very Anglo-centric in Australia, and we need that needs to really shift, and that's a lot of what we're about.
Thank you,
And
Claire.
if
Phil.
you just imagine there was no Radio Australia, no television into the region, how many more people would not know anything about who we are? And how hard would it be for the Australian government and for Australian people to integrate, to have a dialogue? I think it would be a lot less, And when I was doing my show and we were in Asia, when we started, there was crickets. We would get nothing back, no emails, no texts, no anything. And over 9 years, we got a heap. We started having dialogues with locals, and we were doing outside broadcasts from there. And but it was just dead. And so we saw the enlivening of that kind of thing, and that's, so that's it. If we didn't have it, what would we have? We would not be where we are now, I think.
Thank you, both of you, so much, and thank you to the audience. We're going to wrap it up here, although hopefully Claire and Phil can stay for a few minutes if you want to nobble them and ask a very particular question. I'd like to, on behalf of everybody, thank Claire Gorman and Phil Kafcaloudes for being our special guests this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
I also want to thank the City of Yarra and the staff here at Barunganan, and to everybody at ABC Friends who helped with this evening, Max Thompson for the design of the publicity, Michael Bond for administering the registration, and thanks to Brendan Muller for making sure that the sound worked. as I say, a few more minutes in the room and a chance to perhaps catch one of our speakers, and a chance too to listen to the piece of music that won Pacific Beats music competition this year. An artist, a rapper, his name is Mantis, he's from Vanuatu, and the winning track is called Weatherman.